Good evening, everybody. Brian Neubert here from goldenblack.com for the last time this season, live in Wells Fargo Center here in Philadelphia following the conclusion of Purdue's season, the unceremonious end of Purdue's season, 67-64 to the Peacocks of St. Peter's. This is your goldenblack.com post-game wrap video. It's brought to you by our friends at the Purdue Club Hotel, home of the Boiler Up Bar. I'm done at the NCAA tournament, so if including some sponsorship stuff there gets me kicked out of this year's tournament, I'm good. Purdue, obviously, not the ending it wanted. This caps what I've been calling an unfulfilling season for Purdue. Many of you would call a disappointing season for Purdue. I would not argue with you if you used the word disappointing. I don't think a lot of people would. Purdue falls one game short of a Big Ten regular season title, one game short of a Big Ten tournament title. Why am I talking so fast? And now well short of what it wanted to do in the NCAA tournament. Falling to St. Peter's and becoming a weird and most unwelcome footnote to history as St. Peter's becomes the first number 15 seed to ever reach the Elite Eight, and that consequently then makes Purdue that footnote, that they are the team that got beat by a 15 seed to let them get to the Elite Eight. If you watch this game, I think you saw a St. Peter's team that demands respect, that should be viewed as something much more than a 15 seed. And I'm not saying that to ease the sting of the loss for Purdue. I'm saying it because it's real, because that was a good basketball team that Purdue just played. And this was not a Bryce Drew making a miracle shot against Mississippi. This was not a Cinderella anything. This was not a fluke. This was what Purdue has been all season long. There have been fatal flaws in this team that have been there from day one and are now remaining here on day whatever this is. They have been in the DNA of this team. They are the reason Purdue didn't win a Big Ten title of any kind. They are the reason Purdue is out of the NCAA tournament in the first game of the second weekend, and they are things that Purdue just never got its arms around, whatever. They are the turnover issue, obviously, as you don't even need me to talk about it anymore. Purdue was never a team that valued the basketball to the extent that it needed to value the basketball. This was never a great defensive team. They played much better over the last 6 weeks, but much better being relative because they weren't very good prior. And even when you had been trending well leading up to the end of this season, you still can't keep St. Peter's off the foul line in the last 5-6 minutes of this game. I don't even remember what the number was, but it was like 15 of their last 17 or 19 points or whatever it was came at the foul line. That's probably wrong, so just go ahead and read my story. It's in there if you care that much. You probably don't, but can't keep St. Peter's off the foul line. This was what Purdue was all season, and it was always hanging over Purdue's head that this sort of performance was going to come out at the wrong time and end Purdue's season. Every time you thought maybe they had their hands around it, their arms around it, whatever appendage you want to cite with that, it came back, and it was really troubling when the turnover thing cost Purdue in the Big Ten tournament title game against Iowa, because that was a championship situation with actual tangible things at stake, and the turnover issue again came to bear and cost Purdue that game. That was troubling, and it was a reminder that this was not out of Purdue's system, that what Purdue was on day one of the season was different from what it was on the final few days of the season, but it was still relatively similar in terms of the things that could show up and get Purdue beat. Purdue just never developed that sort of basketball maturity it needed to, put in place the really, really important foundational elements to basketball, in addition to some of the like eye-popping stuff they were able to do with just their sheer talent, their sheer skill, all of that stuff. I think Purdue, had they taken better care of the basketball, had they been better defensively, had they been much more in line with a typical Purdue team, I think that was the disconnect here between expectations and reality, was that this was never that prototypical Purdue team, yet they were so often perceived that way. People did not acknowledge, at least nationally, I don't know, I'm always kind of old man yelling at cloud about, the defensive efficiency metric, because what that didn't take into account was turnovers. Turnovers were such an enormous part of Purdue's problem. I'm not saying Purdue is necessarily a great or even good defensive team most of the year. I'm saying that metric lacked context. What that does, the way Ken Pom does that is not a performance metric. That is an estimate of how many points you would allow per 100 possessions. And a lot goes into allowing points. Turnovers go into allowing points. And that was part of Purdue's issue, and that was Purdue's issue so often when they lost. And many times when they were in positions to lose at the end of games. It was their single biggest fatal flaw on this team. It was a reflection of basketball maturity, something this team never grew into, which they didn't do a horrible job with it last year. So why things went sideways on them this year, I couldn't venture a guess. But there were some systemic things with this team where you were going to have to eat some turnovers. You had two very, very high-volume avenues of offense between Jaden Ivey, wanting him to be aggressive, and Ross-Ade and Travion Williams, and the natural measure of turnover vulnerability you have to accept when you play through the post. So there was some systemic stuff in terms of the turnover totals, but it's the situations where you just play yourself out of the game by turning the ball over. It's the situations where it's 5 out of 7 possessions against Iowa, whatever it was, the whole second half against Michigan State. Today, the majority of the game, 15 turnovers. That's not just the 11 points St. Peter's got off those 15 turnovers. It's what Purdue didn't get off those 15 possessions. So you cut that in half, you figure that's maybe 6 fewer St. Peter's points and probably 6 more Purdue points. That's a pretty big swing. Again, I don't have to do the calculus of turnovers and why they matter in basketball. You guys are smart enough to know why not having the basketball and giving it to your opponent is a problem. But it was a problem Purdue never got past. And I think, and I will say this again, I do think people got way ahead of themselves on this team. Whether I specifically articulated that or not back in November, I don't know, but I remember doing my best to try to point out some red flags that were going on with that team, even when they were rolling over people, even when they were winning in Connecticut. Like, what was going to happen when Purdue couldn't just outscore everyone? And you got the answer to that question here the last 2.5 months, is when teams got Purdue in Big Ten style of basketball games. This would qualify. This was very Big Ten-y here today. Purdue struggled because the things that win those basketball games were never this team's strengths. They were never a great half-court defensive team. They got better, yes, but they were never great. They were never, I don't know if I'd say they were good. I think they were good, closer to good later in the season. They were certainly better, but I still don't know if I'd call Purdue a good defensive team when, the season ultimately ran its course. Again, at the very end of your year here, you can't keep St. Peter's off the foul line. The turnover issue never went away. It was always one of those things where it was hanging over your head at all times. Had Purdue not been able to just outscore everyone in November, you kind of wonder if they would have had to condition themselves to win otherwise. Maybe there were some important lessons there that were just buried in three-pointers back in November. I don't know, but this team never grew into that. Whose fault is that? Everything ultimately lies on the coach, obviously. That goes without saying. But at some point in time, too, when the same things start happening over and over again, that is a situation where everyone's at fault. But guys have to do a better job with it. Guys have to take some personal pride in it. I think, Purdue, again, has some systemic issues with the turnovers in terms of how much usage is coming from situations where you need to be vulnerable to some measure of turnover vulnerability. How many times can I say vulnerability in one sentence? But this also just came down to valuing possessions, taking better shots, taking good shots. Now, Jaden Ivey, you needed him being aggressive, so you had to live with some of that. When you have a player like that, sometimes you just have to ride the lightning. You have to let him kind of do his thing and know ultimately at the end of the day you're probably going to come out on the plus end of that. But it's just about valuing possessions. It's just about hoarding possessions. It's about being better with loose balls. Purdue was not a good loose ball team this year, and that's where people perceiving this Purdue team as a traditional Purdue team because it says Purdue on their shirts, was always a flawed view, because this was never that 1980s, 1990s Purdue team where you knew they were going to step on your head to get a loose ball. You knew they were going to protect the ball at all costs from an offensive perspective. This was much more of I always say, kind of a white-collar team as opposed to a blue-collar team where they could out-talent you, but when things got hard, when teams sometimes just played solid and got out of the way and gave Purdue opportunities to beat themselves, Purdue obliged. And that was just the basketball maturity that this team never really took on, and that's a big part of the reason why its season is over right now. Unexpectedly, well, I shouldn't say unexpectedly. St. Peter's is here for a reason. I don't want to make this sound like Purdue just got beat by the bad news Bears here, because 15 seed or not, that was a good basketball team. A really good defensive team, played really hard. Shaheen Holloway is going to do a hell of a job at Seton Hall here, starting probably 4 hours after they're eliminated from the NCAA tournament, or they win the national title. Who knows? But that's the thing about the NCAA tournament, is that this is the most random team championship event in sports, if you ask me. And it is unfortunate, and I know I'm saying this to people who are mad right now at Matt Painter. Fine. I get it. But it is unfortunate. This is what coaches get judged by, because what you're doing basically is you're taking 68 teams, you're putting them in a barrel, you're shaking it up, and one of them's got to punch their way out of it. And more often than not, that's one of the better teams in college basketball, because they're better suited to survive 6 games as opposed to some of the smaller teams who don't have the same resources from a personnel perspective, don't have the same level of coaching, whatever it might be. But it is a very random deal, and I think it's becoming even more random because of the three-pointer. Its prevalence in basketball nowadays is basketball. And when you live by the three-pointer, you also die by the three-pointer. And once again, Purdue dies by the three-pointer in the second half here. They're 1 for 12. The only make came with 8 seconds to go. The Jaden Ivey heave that gave Purdue a chance. Credit to him for making that. But Purdue, again, you live by the 3, you die by the 3, and in a randomized event like this where it's single elimination, and it's not like this is best of 7, that is a tough deal. You better be pretty good and pretty consistent, or do a pretty good job being solid everywhere else. Again, the area where Purdue just never got to where it needed to be. It always just had to outscore people to win, and that is not a winning formula necessarily in the Big Ten. That being said, Purdue won 29 games. Again, I'm in that same position all year long, where when you cover a really good team, you talk so much about what went wrong as opposed to what went right. So I don't want to make it sound like Purdue, stunk all year. I don't want to make it sound like they were Northwestern this year. They won 29 games. They're one short of a school record. They were 4 points away from tying a school record for wins. I know that's unfulfilling in the moment because there's no hardware, there's no elusive Final Four, to show for it. But it was what it was. There was just a very small gap this year between being really good and being great, and Purdue could just never close that gap. Just like that. That they could never do that. And keep it closed. I mean, there were flashes and all that stuff, but they were never able to keep it closed. I don't know if all of that makes sense or not, but I'm just trying to rationalize how things went wrong for Purdue. I do think people did, see some things maybe in November that weren't necessarily there. I do think that, Purdue fans, God love them. I think you're an excitable people. I think that it's a very positive thing that everyone is as Final Four hungry as they are. Believe me, I can promise you Purdue wants it as bad as you do, probably more so than you do. But I do think people, talking about New Orleans in November, was a bit premature. And I think that there were some red flags there that I think blissful ignorance, or at least blissful oversight, might have contributed to being relatively ignored. I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but I do think, all the things that got Purdue beat tonight against St. Peter's, they were sitting there in November and December too. It's just a matter of when Purdue lost, they really came to the forefront. And I think that's pretty much all I have to say about the game. I do want to thank everyone for this past year. Your enthusiasm was much appreciated, even to those who, had a season-long panic attack about this Purdue team. And to those of you who, I shouldn't even say this, but honest to God, made this the most miserable I've ever been covering a Purdue basketball season, just because of the powder keg nature of this season. Just the excitement's a good thing, but stuff can kind of get weaponized and get out of hand a little bit right now at times. But I do want to thank everybody for all of your support through this year, all of your enthusiasm for our product, all of your enthusiasm toward the subject matter, all of that stuff. But I also do want to remind everyone, as a fellow human being, life is too short to worry about things that don't really matter at the end of the day and that can affect our personal happiness. So at the end of the day, I know this sounds empty to say to you after a loss that many of you are, I'm sure, devastated by, but it's just basketball. It's a basketball game. It's not about you. It's not about me. It's about them, and they are not thrilled right now, as you might imagine. So that's pretty much what I have to say from Philadelphia. So thank you for watching. Thank you for reading. Thank you for listening, and thank you for processing our materials, however you process our materials. I will talk to you guys next season. Actually, I think we'll probably do some sort of periodic little check-in on video. I know that's very exciting, but we'll try to do something. Thank you to the Purdue Club Hotel for all your support through this course of the year. Thank you to the Boiler Up Bar for your adjacent support via the Purdue Club Hotel. We appreciate it very much. And I hope you all have a really good rest of your spring. Unless you count it as still being winter, in which case, have a good rest of your winter. Thanks, everybody.